Our first speaker is Caitlin O'Donnell, who graduated from Villanova University in 2011 with a dual degree in geography and Arabic. Always one for the winding road, she then served 2 years with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps as a high school teacher in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Caitlin is currently a macro global practice student at the School of Social Work and is particularly interested in serving the global refugee population. Ladies and gentlemen, Caitlin O'Donnell.
Can you hear me, first of all? We're okay? I'm not going to use the stage. I feel like it's not that hard to see me, so I'm just going to stand on the floor if that's okay. All right, here we go. When I arrived in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in December of 2011, I knew exactly one word in the country's national language, which is Swahili. The Jesuit Volunteer Corps had placed me in East Africa to serve as a teacher in a Jesuit high school for 2 years, and by and large, they did an amazing job preparing me for this role, except they did not give me language training. That's where Tanzania is, by the way. So I tried to teach myself some of this language before I left the United States and learn some vocabulary words and become familiar with it. Clearly, I didn't try very hard, though, because by the time I got to Tanzania, like I said, I only knew one word. The good news is that this was like the most useful word I possibly could have gone into Tanzania with. And actually, if you're up for it, I'm going to teach it to you now. So the phrase is nimepotea. So try repeating it after me. Nimepotea. Oh, sorry, jumping the gun there. Nimepotea. One more time. Nimepotea? Awesome. Now you know how to say I'm lost in Swahili. The reason I said that this was such a useful phrase for me to know is because I was lost all the time in East Africa. I had never experienced anything like it before I arrived. And so being lost was kind of a constant state of being for me in the beginning. I got lost in this new culture. I got lost trying to figure out what's appropriate and what is not appropriate. I got lost in the very literal sense of being lost as I tried to navigate my way through my new environment. I lived in a neighborhood of Dar es Salaam called Mabibo. So a lot like Boston, Dar es Salaam is a city comprised of smaller neighborhoods. And mine, Mabibo, was one of the lower income parts of the city, so that meant the houses were pretty small, they were really simple, and most notably, they were really close together. The neighborhood was really densely populated. So dense that in most parts of the city, there was not enough room for a street or a road where a car could drive through. So what this meant for me was the only way to navigate through Mabibo was to follow this intricate network of footpaths that were all unmarked, of course. They wove around the houses and alleyways and under low-hanging lines of laundry. Every day was an adventure when I left my house. And I made a lot of wrong turns, but the good news is I was armed with this magical phrase, nimepotea. All I had to do was tell any of my neighbors, I'm really lost, and they would happily point me in the right direction. More than anywhere else, though, I got lost in the language of Swahili. I wanted it. I wanted to be able to communicate and understand what people were saying to me. But there was a lot to learn, and I was trying to learn it all by myself. So I made a lot of mistakes. God knows I tried, and I studied. I tried every technique in the book to memorize vocabulary words. But still, I made a lot of mistakes. The kids in my neighborhood, for example, loved to remind me of the time I confused two Swahili phrases. One of them, Nina Elewa, and the other, Nina Lewa. Nina Elewa is what I intended to say. It's a really nice word that means I understand. What I actually said was Nina Lewa, which means I'm drunk. So that conversation didn't go very well with the children, obviously. But more than anywhere else, even though I felt really overwhelmed by this language and overwhelmed by this environment that I was getting used to, I always felt enormously supported. And that support was critical for me because it gave me the courage to keep going out there and learning the lay of the land in my neighborhood, or eventually I became conversational in Swahili. Some of that had to do with the support of my friends and family back in the United States. This is a picture of my family when they actually came to visit me in Tanzania, which was really special. But more immediately, while I was in Tanzania, I had a lot of support from my neighbors and my friends in the neighborhood. Mabibo was an enormously tight-knit community. They relied on each other for everything, for food, for money, for friendship. And they folded me right into that network, no questions asked. The women wanted to teach me how to wear their clothes, and the men wanted to teach me about their soccer teams, and I was invited into their homes for meals all the time. I felt so welcome, so lucky, and very quickly I felt like I was finding a second home in Tanzania. But you have to understand the context to all of this, because I can tell you about how generous everyone was, but it won't mean very much unless you understand the background to all of it, because that's what made it very powerful. The reality is Tanzania is one of the poorest countries in the world. Take a look at the country's national GDP. That figure, $36.6 billion, is from the year 2014. That same year, Harvard University's endowment was $36.4 billion. That says a lot about both parties, I think, but especially speaks to the level of poverty that Tanzanians were contending with. Life for my neighbors was really, really hard. They didn't have very much, and yet they shared so much with me without thinking twice. I felt so lucky. But all of these positive, warm, fuzzy feelings that I was having for this community were seriously called into question for me about 5 months into my time in Tanzania. So we're talking about like April 2012. I woke up in the middle of one night, it was like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and I heard some yelling coming from somewhere nearby in the neighborhood. Now, this was not totally unprecedented. Remember, the houses are really close together, so noises and even smells would come drifting through the house from time to time. And that night, I remember thinking that the voices belonged to some of the neighborhood soccer fanatics. They would routinely stay up until the middle of the night because of the European soccer games and the time change. So I thought someone scored, someone lost. Honestly, I didn't really care because I was trying to sleep, and I fell back asleep. The next morning started off like any other. It was a school day, so I had to go to school. And when I left the house, though, I was confronted with a sight that was definitely not normal. At a distance, maybe from me to the back of this room, so not very far, there was a large ring of people. I recognized all of them. They were all my neighbors. And they were standing around something on the ground. So I approached. And when I did, I saw that what was on the ground was actually who was on the ground. There was a man there, and he was dead. And he was in a really bad way. He had been severely beaten, and his hands and his feet were zip-tied together. So that was a disturbing sight, and it happened really close to my house, so naturally I asked some questions. And my neighbors were able to fill me in on what had happened that night. The night that I had heard all the yelling, this young man had been caught peeping into someone's window, presumably to enter and break in and steal something, although that was never proven. He was a man from Mabibo. He was from the neighborhood. He was a few years older than me, so he was in his late 20s. His name was Musa. And the owner of the house saw Musa looking into her window, and being afraid, assuming the worst, she cried out for help. And she used a Swahili word that, for once, I remembered it immediately. Like, this was not a hard one for me to remember. She used the word mwizi, which means thief. So she cries out, mwizi, mwizi, and people in the neighborhood hear her, and they come to help her out. Now, initially I heard that story, and I was like, oh, that's really nice. Like, the community is looking out for each other. But what they did next was definitely not nice. They caught Musa, and they beat him up, and they zip-tied him, and then in front of a crowd of his own neighbors, Musa was stoned to death. I always get goosebumps at this part in the story because I can't imagine anything more horrible than what Musa must have been experiencing in his final moments on Earth. I didn't understand how my neighbors could show me so much generosity and patience and then be so brutal towards Musa. I had enjoyed the privilege of being lost in this neighborhood and in this culture for months, bumbling around like a fool in Mabibo, but this guy made one wrong turn one night and paid the price with his life. A big part of me didn't want anything to do with the community after that. I wanted to throw up my hands and be like, this is messed up. This would never happen in America. But I was taunted by this question of like, why it had happened. Because when I remembered that morning, when I saw all those people standing around Musa's body, everyone was upset too. Like, no one was pumping fists saying, good job, we stuck it to that guy. There was none of that. People were really upset. And so if this was such a negative thing for them too, then why had they allowed it to happen? My neighbors in Mabibo did not have a police force that they could call. There's no 911. The police were notoriously corrupt. They showed up to the scene of this murder like 4 or 6 hours after it had happened. My neighbors didn't have access to a legal system where they could have criminals prosecuted and prevent crime from occurring over and over again in their neighborhoods. They didn't have social services like we enjoy that provide a safety net when the worst should happen, like, for instance, if someone broke into your home and stole something. Most of my neighbors didn't have anything that could be stolen from them. They were really poor. They were trying to survive like a whole family on like $5 a day. So if I were them, put myself in that position, if I were a Tanzanian living in Mabibo and someone crept into my neighborhood in the dead of night and betrayed my trust and threatened the safety of my neighborhood and the security of my family and tried to take what little I had, and I couldn't count on anybody else to stop this guy and prevent it from happening again, would I have done what they did? For me, the conclusion was yes. I totally would have done what they did. And with that in mind, what happened to Musa, to me, did not seem any less terrible, but certainly reasonable. And that is the thrust of what that really difficult day taught me, is that poverty and social injustice drive people to do insanely desperate things, even people as loving and peaceful as my neighbors in Mabibo. What they did that day was really, really intense and wrong, we can say, but they did it because they had no alternative. They were not broken, but the systems, the political, the social, the economic systems that they lived in that boxed them into that corner and pushed them to the limits of their humanity that night, those systems were broken. I don't want to live in a world where communal stonings are anything close to reasonable, ever. I don't want to live in a world where mwizi is a Swahili lesson that anybody has to learn. When I leave Boston College next spring as a graduate of the social work program, I want to work towards repairing these systems that are broken and that force people to do the things that my neighbors had to do. For me, I envision a world where Swahili lessons are not about mwizi, but are about words like upendo, which means love, and amani, which means peace, and haki, which means justice. Thank you.